Good afternoon, everybody. I want to talk to you about an interesting situation that happened during World War II. It involved a B-17, probably made right here in Seattle, and a German Luftwaffe pilot. And there's a very interesting book. I was given this book by a fellow at work. It's called A Higher Call. And I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but it's basically the story about Franz Stiegler, the German pilot. He was born in 1915 in southern Germany to a rather, not a well-to-do family, but they weren't poor either. And he loved flying. His dad had been a pilot in World War I, and he followed in his dad's footsteps. And at 20 years old, he became a pilot for Lufthansa Airlines in Germany in 1930s. In 1937, he was in the he was in the airport, and a German officer walked up to him and gave him some papers and said, "Welcome to the Luftwaffe. You're now in the service of the country." He had no choice. The only choice he had was to refuse. If he refused, he would either go in the army or he would be shot. There were only a couple of choices. So he loved to fly. So initially he flew transport planes and so forth for the Luftwaffe. But eventually he became a fighter pilot, and an exceptionally good fighter pilot. He served in North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy, and then on up into Germany. And in December 20th, 1943, there was a whole squadron of B-17s flying over northern Germany to Bremen to do a bombing run. And they were intercepted by the Luftwaffe. A number of planes were shot down. One particular B-17 was badly, not destroyed, but very, very badly shot up. And once you're shot up, and you have engine failure, one engine failed, another engine was racing and running away. Basically had two good engines. He fell behind the squadron. And the Luftwaffe jumped on him. And the only thing the pilot could do in the B-17 was circle. He made circles. It's the only hope he had. Well, pretty soon he tightened up the circle so much that he lost it and dove, and he just lost control. So he's diving towards the earth, and he pulled out at the last moment, just before crashing, skimmed over a village in northern Germany, had enough momentum climb back up to about 2,000 feet. And perchance, Franz Stiegler had landed his fighter because he was low on fuel and was rearming. And he was at an airport not far from where the B-17 pulled out of its dive and flew past. And Franz said, "Wow, that's going to be an easy one to get." So he got back in his plane and chased after it, caught up to it very quickly because it was flying so slow. He had to throttle way back keep from overrunning it. And he thought, what's wrong with that tail gunner? He's not, because the B-17, just to explain a little bit, was called the Flying Fortress because it was bristling with guns from every direction. It had gun turrets all around the plane. But the rear gun turret, there was no response when he came up to the plane. He said to himself, well, it's either going to be me or that plane that's going to go down. Well, the rear gun turret never responded. The guns were facing down. And he got up close enough, and he could see the guy was injured that was in there, and a good part of the canopy was blown away. And he thought, wow, okay. So he pulled up alongside the plane, and he couldn't believe the destruction. He could actually see inside that plane. He could see wounded men inside the plane. And he thought, I can't shoot these guys down. They're struggling, they're striving. So he pulled up alongside the co-pilot side of the plane, and he motioned down, land this plane, get out of the sky. Well, there was no co-pilot over there. So he went around to the other side, and the pilot was there, and he was just pretty much frozen, hanging on to this plane, trying to keep it flying. Finally, he glanced over and saw the German, Franz Stiegler, and he thought, well, this is the end. The pilot of the B-17, he thought, yeah, he's just checking this out. And so he noticed the pilot of the Messerschmitt, the German. He's pointing down. He says, he just shook his head. No, I'm not going down. He said, I'm not going. Well, he was a long ways from England. He was at least 2.5 hours out of England. Try and fly that plane back to England with that kind of damage just didn't make any sense. Well, the German, he said, I can't take these guys down. So he started mouthing to them, Sweden, fly to Sweden. This was North Germany. It wasn't very far to Sweden. It was only about a half-hour flight to Sweden. Well, the pilot of the B-17 didn't understand him. He said, well, and he kept pointing towards Sweden. Well, the pilot just didn't understand. And pretty soon, they were coming up on the German coast, and all the artillery batteries that were on the German coast were going to take this B-17 down. So the German said, you know what, I'm going to fly with these guys and try and get them out of Germany. And during the war, there were some B-17s that had come down in Germany that were repairable and fixable. So that actually the Luftwaffe had some B-17s that they flew themselves. And so it wasn't uncommon to see a lone B-17 flying around with another German escort. So he escorted them out of Germany. They never fired on that B-17, even though they could tell it was badly battered. So he escorted them out over into the North Sea, and he kept motioning, Sweden. He kept trying to say Sweden. The pilot wouldn't go. He turned to the left, headed toward England. Franz said, those guys will never make it. Never make it. He said, I can't go any further with them. I'll run out of fuel myself. He said, he gave him a salute and headed back to Germany. Well, miraculously, that B-17 did make it back to England. They threw everything out of that plane, the ones that were able to, threw everything out of that plane they could to try and keep it afloat in the air. And they did. They flew over the English coast at around 250 feet, just treetop skimming. Well, Franz went back to Germany and was in the war, and he actually survived the war. But what's really interesting here is the compassion that he had. I mean, he was a tremendous fighter pilot, and at one point he was trying to gain the flying, what would they call it, the German Cross, I think it was. And he had to shoot down like 30 airplanes, and he was very close to that. But for this moment in time, he said, there seemed to be a higher call. These guys were struggling so much. And so his compassion saved that crew. And it's amazing what compassion can do for other people. I think God called us because he knew we were a compassionate people. I don't think he's calling too many people that have no compassion. Compassion can be so uplifting and so fulfilling. And let's just read here in Exodus 34, verse 6. This is when Moses was gone back up to the mountain with a second set of tablets to see Jesus Christ, or God. And he wanted to see, actually, God in his power, in his glory. Well, God said, no, you can't do that. I'll hold my hand over your face. I'll go by. You can see my backside after I'm gone. But this is what God, and as we know, this is Jesus Christ, said about himself and his Father. So Exodus 34, verse 6 states, and the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering, abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquities and transgressions. So God is full of compassion. I mean, you think of all the things that some of us have done throughout our lives, and the compassion that he has for us and the love he has for us. He certainly wants to see us change and repent and be who we should be. But his compassion is just, it's incomprehensible. And you think about Jesus Christ's life here on earth, when very near the end of his life, he was being taken by the high priest and his men. And when Peter took out his sword and cut off the servant of the high priest's ear, what did Jesus Christ do? He rebuked Peter, But he also healed that man, put the ear back on, and he was healed. And I'm sure he wasn't a friend of Jesus Christ. It'll be interesting to find out what happened to that high servant if he, after having been healed like that, if he repented and changed later in his life and became a part of God's church. It's a possibility. I don't know. But compassion is just overwhelming what it can do for people. But also we have to be careful with compassion too. We also have to have tough love at times. Tough love is needed in various situations. And even that's compassion. Even when we are rebuked, when we are punished by God, that's still compassion because God wants to see us change. So some of you are familiar with Paul Harvey, and he always talked about the rest of the story. Well, this is the rest of the story about Franz Stiegler and the pilot of the B-17. Franz had a very, very difficult time in Germany after the war. He actually one of the few Luftwaffe pilots that survived the war. And a lot of the German people hated the Luftwaffe because they didn't protect Germany from what they called the four motors, the B-17 bombers, that devastated Germany so much. He couldn't get a job. He struggled and struggled. Finally, he got a job back at the old Messerschmitt plant that had built his fighter planes. He was making sewing machines. And he said, I've had it with Germany. I can't stay here anymore. People don't respect us. He had a very difficult time. And he saw all the destruction, and in the early 50s, there was still a lot of destruction in Germany. He says, I got to get out of here. So he had a brother-in-law that lived in Canada, up here in British Columbia. And so he got a job in Germany, while he was still in Germany, with a airplane manufacturer in Canada to help with a new fighter jet they were going to design and build. And so he immigrated to Vancouver area. Well, when he got here, and they found out his record and found out his past, how involved he was with the Luftwaffe, even though he was never a Nazi, he never joined the Nazi party. They said, I'm sorry, you can't get a job here. So he ended up out of the logging camp on the Queen Charlotte Islands, where his brother-in-law was, repairing diesel engines for the logging trucks and various equipment. Well, every once in a while, this incident in 1943 would come back to him and say, what can I do? Well, he ended up buying an old Messerschmitt plane and started flying again, and he would pretend to be the bad guy at air shows, flying against P-51 Mustangs and some of the other fighter planes that we had. And the Boeing company heard about it. And in 1985, it was the 50th anniversary of the Boeing B-17. And so he was invited down here to Seattle for a reunion of the 50th anniversary of the B-17. And he said, oh man, I can't go. Those guys will kill me. They'll hate me. As many of them I shot out of the sky. Well, he had never even told his wife what he had done in 1943. He finally told her. He said, you know what I did? And she was amazed. And she said, Franz, you ought to go. You ought to go. So he did. He came down here, met with some of the bomber crews, and they just accepted him and said, wow, they were very compassionate to an enemy. And he asked around if anybody knew about this plane that had been horribly shot up and still made it back to England. Nobody knew anything. Nobody knew anything. So he went back to Canada. But in the meantime, down in Florida, the pilot of that B-17 was wondering the same thing. I wonder, has anybody ever heard of a German plane that escorted us out of Germany? And this is around the same time, 1980 sometime, late 80s. Well, he finally got a hold of a publication in Germany that was for the old Luftwaffe pilots. And he wanted to put an ad in there about the incident. Well, initially they turned him down and said, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. Well, he ended up getting a hold of a general that had been in the Luftwaffe, and the general said, I'll make sure that gets in the publication. So it did. And guess who takes the publication? Franz Stigler, up in the Queen Charlotte Islands. Well, he'd actually moved to Vancouver by that time. He'd retired. Vancouver area. And he said, wow, those guys made it. Those guys made it. And it just, it was just astounding to him, so he wrote to him. And so the pilot of the B-17, and you'll never guess his name, but it was Charlie Brown. Charlie Brown was his name. He started to write back to him. He said, I can't do it. I just got to call him. And he had no phone number. The guy didn't leave a phone number or anything. So he ended up calling information, got the phone number, and they ended up talking. And Charlie Brown had not relayed all the information about what had transpired because he was afraid others would call in that had nothing to do with this and just say, well, yeah, it was me. I did it. But no, this guy, he knew everything about the incident. So a few months later, they got together right here in Seattle. Franz came down from Canada, and Charlie Brown flew up from Florida, and they had a wonderful get-together, hugged, and Charlie Brown just couldn't get over that this guy was still alive, because most of the Luftwaffe was wiped out during World War II. And so after that meeting, they got together quite often, and there was another group that got together that was actually the flying group that Charlie Brown flew with back on the East Coast. So Charlie Brown invited Franz to go back to that meeting. And so he did. And they had some B-17s there, and they were talking under it. And Charlie Brown said, you know what, Franz, I want you to meet a couple guys. So these old guys come toddling out. And they're part of the old crew of that B-17. And they hugged and just, bawled all over Franz because he had saved their lives. Well, then, Charlie Brown said, I want you to meet some other people. 23 other people came out. They were the offspring of those men. And they said, you know what, Charlie, Franz Stigler, if you'd have shot that plane down, if you'd have shot us down, these people wouldn't be here. None of them would be here. So it was a great reunion. They stayed together. They were great friends. And I want to read to you what Franz said to, it was a handwritten note that was in a book that Franz gave to Charlie Brown. He said, in 1940, I lost my only brother. On December 20th of 1943, I had the chance to save a B-17 from destruction, a plane so badly damaged, it was a miracle it was still flying. The pilot, Charlie Brown, is for me as precious as my brother. It goes both ways. Charlie Brown was exceedingly grateful and thankful for the compassion of Franz Stigler. And Franz Stigler was very, very compassionate towards him, and likewise, Charlie Brown was compassionate to Franz Stigler. He could have been, as a lot of people were, they had a difficult time with compassion. Some people do, but this is just and most incredible story I think I've read about compassion. And we know how much compassion can mean to other people. So, brethren, I hope we can think on compassion, how much difference it can make in people's lives. It may not be anything similar to this. It may be something extremely small, but you never know. Doing the smallest thing for somebody could have a big difference in their lives.